everyone. My name is Mina Nabavi, and I'm a program manager with the UAB CounterACT Research Center of Excellence in Arsenicals. Welcome to today's Grand Rounds seminar. For those of you not familiar with our center, it is led by Dr. Mohammed Athar, and the goal of the center is to develop mechanism-based, highly effective medical countermeasures against arsenical chemical warfare agents. I want to share a couple of upcoming activities and events within our center. On Friday, March 19th, the UAB Research Center of Excellence in Arsenicals is one of the sponsors for the Center for Clinical and Translational Science Bioethics Forum, which will be held virtually from 10 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. Please remember to save the date, and as soon as the registration link is available, it will be published on our website, which is uab.edu/arsenicals, and an email will be sent to our CounterACT group. Also, make note to hold March 25th to hear Dr. Neera Tewari Singh speak on toxicity from chemical threat agent phosgene oxime skin exposure. Dr. Tewari Singh is an assistant professor at Michigan State University in the Department of Pharmacology and Toxicology. A flyer and registration link will be available soon. Then, on April 15th at 12 p.m. noon, Dr. Mohammed Athar will be presenting on molecular mechanisms underlying cutaneous chemical burns caused by arsenical exposure. We will be sending registration information for this seminar soon, but in the meantime, please hold the date and time on your calendar. And for those of you involved with the NIH CounterACT program, please remember to save the date for the next NIH CounterACT Symposium, which will be held December 6th through the 8th later of this year. The UAB Research Center of Excellence in Arsenicals will be hosting NIH's annual CounterACT Research Symposium in New Orleans, Louisiana. For more information on the center or its activities, please visit our website at uab.edu/arsenicals or send us an email at as33@uab.edu. On the website, you will find links to recordings of past Grand Rounds, presentations, and our podcast.
Thank you very much, Mina. It's my pleasure to welcome today our speaker, Mr. Terry Tincher. Mr. Terry Tincher is currently at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. At the CDC, he serves as the chief of the Chemical Demilitarization section. This section is located in the Division of Environmental Health Science and Practice. This section that Mr. Tincher leads is required because public law requires that the CDC reviews particulars and plans that are associated with transportation and disposal of lethal chemical warfare materials. And that the goal of that is, of course, ensuring the health of the public and its safety. Now, Mr. Tincher's team focuses on human health for both workers and the community, particularly from potential exposures to chemical agents. Now, to do all of that, Mr. Tincher has to collaborate with a multidisciplinary team, and you will learn more about his profession and his section if you listen to our podcast. I've known Terry for almost 15 years, and I've always looked at him as an expert in all of this important topic that we have to deal with in the US, as well as around the world. His team really is leading this for us in the US, and it's a pleasure to have him with us today. Now, as far as his professional background, Terry has a BS in chemical engineering from West Virginia Institute of Technology and a master's degree in engineering from North Carolina State University. He's also, of course, a certified safety professional as well. He has over 20 years of experience in this field. He's worked before CDC as well in this area. And it's really an honor for us to have him today, and we look forward to his presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Kazi. I really appreciate that introduction. We'll get started here and talk about the history of chemical weapons and its destruction. And you may wonder why we want to learn about that. And, you know, in order to be able to deal with the issues that we have and so forth is to know your enemy. And if you understand the history of chemical weapons, how some of them were made, and then how they were used and what they were designed for, it will help us be able to deal with them as we treat people who could potentially be exposed, either from recovery, destruction, or treacherous uses. And we tend to think about the beginning as being World War I, and General Blackjack Pershing said after the war, whether or not gas will be employed in future wars is a matter of conjecture. But the effect is so deadly to the unprepared that we can never afford to neglect that question. And so if you look at the history of chemical warfare, it actually started much, much, much later. There was arsenic smoke used in the Peloponnesian War. And in other wars, they used what they called Greek fire. Byzantine Empire used it, and it was essentially a flamethrower, and it was a combustible compound that could burn on water. And some scientists believe it was probably a mixture of naphtha and quicklime, and it was a very, very effective weapon. And then as we came into the industrial age, around 1899, a lot of advances in chemistry happened very, very quickly. And there were a lot of very toxic materials made. And so the first time anybody really thought about trying to control the use of that and prohibiting it to be used in warfare was in 1899, before World War I. The Hague had an agreement. And so this was the first agreement, but of course, no one listened to it. April of 1915 was a hallmark time because in Belgium, they used chlorine to perfect the first gas attack in major modern warfare. It was really kind of clumsy in a way, but very unique in that they stacked chlorine gas bottles along the trenches and attached pipelines and tubing between them. And they actually had soldiers in what was at that time a relatively new invention called the Draeger self-contained breathing apparatus, the modern day precursor of our SCBAs. And they actually opened up the valves to allow the chlorine to drift over the battlefield and the trenches. And of course, chlorine was heavier than air, so it was very, very effective. But the delivery system was not very effective. So within 2 years, they had developed mustard, a vesicant, to be able to be developed, to be able to be delivered in shells. And that was done at the Second Battle of Ypres. And by the end of the war, using mustard and many others, Adamsite, Lewisite was never actually used in war. There were over 100,000 tons of toxic chemicals had been used. 90,000 soldiers died and more than 1 million casualties. Now, the 90,000 soldiers that died, only about 2% actually died as any type of toxic inhalation or whatever. The majority of the deaths occurred because of the blisters that they got, the open wounds and infections, and the lack of infection control led to many of the deaths. After the war in 1925, we made a second attempt to have control over the use of chemical weapons. And this would not only included chemical weapons, but it also included bacteriological weapons like anthrax. But again, the countries kept producing it and using them. And in World War II, it was used, it was believed in the Civil War in Spain slightly before the war. But the biggest issue that occurred was in Bari, Italy. Several of Liberty ships had docked there to unload cargo, and the Luftwaffe attacked and sank several of these ships. In fact, it was the largest shipping disaster outside of Pearl Harbor suffered during the war. But there was a ship called the John Harvey, and it had hundreds of tons of mustard bombs that were going to be stored in Italy in case of an attack and if they were required. The Luftwaffe didn't know they were there, but they sank the ship. And unfortunately, that mustard mixed with the burning oil to create havoc among the people who survived. They had 617 recorded casualties, merchant marine personnel. And we had the honor of actually working with one of the survivors to help him get treatment. The doctor who was there had been trained in Edgewood and had developed a lot of techniques, and later was one of the people that recognized the use of nitrogen mustard for chemotherapy. One of the good things that came out of the war with respect to chemical weapons. But it was classified what had happened and was never declassified until many years after the war. But this doctor had recognized the symptoms almost immediately and began treatment protocols that he had developed for mustard, and saved numerous people's lives. As we go on today, we still use chemical weapons. Iraq has used them in the Iran-Iraq war against the Kurdish citizens. They were primarily mustard, from what we can understand, though we do believe there might have been some sarin, but mustard is it. In 1993, we had our third attempt, and the most successful to date, the Chemical Weapons Convention. They started with 130 countries that showed support for it. I believe it's up to 180 now. And they had a commission set up that was going to try to figure out a way to enforce it. In 1995, a cult in Tokyo developed a crude and not very clean sarin agent, but it was effective enough to sicken 5,000 people and kill over a dozen. And we'll talk a little bit about what happened there in just a little bit. 97, as a result of some of the things that had been happening, the CWC, the Chemical Weapons Convention, was actually signed. The treaty was signed and entered into force for 87 countries. And like I said, I believe it's 180 now. And the organization created the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, which began in The Hague and now oversees all chemical weapons destruction, is involved in the destruction we do here. The destruction was done in Anniston a few years ago, and then also, if you may remember, in Syria. So the other thing that led to issues in the United States is, why do we start destroying weapons? The biggest issue was public outcry. In the late 60s, Time ran an article on something called Chase. The military, if you probably worked for them, either for them or with them, love acronyms. And Chase stood for cut them and let's see. Chase is cut them and sink them. So they wanted to cut them up, and then they sank Liberty ships left over from World War II. And they ran an article on it, and people had no idea that they were sinking chemical weapons in the ocean, and that there would be over 30,000 tons of chemical weapons sank in the ocean. And then in late 69, there was another issue that arose in Okinawa. They had chemical weapons stored there that they kept on alert should chemical weapons be used by either Russia or China and Vietnam. And they were loading them onto a B-52, and one of the cluster bombs began to leak, and about 6 Air Force men were exposed to sarin agent. And then, of course, that made the news. And then finally, the last straw was in Dugway, out near Salt Lake City in Utah. They were testing VX, and they were using what they call a spray tank. And they were using an F-4 fighter to spray the VX, much like they sprayed Agent Orange. And when the plane began its ascent to go back to land, the valve on the spray tank failed to close like it was supposed to, and it caused the cloud to drift out over a place called, aptly, Skull Valley, and 4,000 sheep were killed. The Army never claimed responsibility, but did provide restitution for the farmers. Over the years, we've had issues either after the wars. In World War I, as I said, we used several 100,000 tons of chemical weapons, and there were many tons, 50 to 60 last count, and most of those were destroyed by dumping in the ocean. The other thing that they did was burial in World War I, and hopefully we'll have enough time to talk about it at the end, with Spring Valley, because that involved some arsenicals. They did open pit burning. That fell out of favor when, if you look over to the right, you'll see kind of a brownish red rocket. Looks like a grenade. It's actually a rocket. When they went to destroy the ones that they had looked at after World War II, the German weapon, it looks like that's the way it should launch, but the exhaust jets are actually on the top. And so they put them in to go into the ground and put them in backwards. And instead of burying them and burning them up, they launched them. And they still find them today. And again, cut holes and sink them. Operation Chase, mentioned that. And then we'll talk a little bit about incineration and neutralization, which are the preferred methods we've gotten to today. We talked about the treaty. It prohibits any development, production, stockpiling, and use of chemical weapons. So the stockpile is what we have in inventory. After they did the inventories, they found other materials or tanks or vessels and so forth that had been used and had chemical weapons in them. They didn't fall in any category and they became non-stockpile. Recovered weapons, weapons that were buried after the war, after both wars, and then production facilities were all to be destroyed and have been as we speak. So let's take a look at the chemical agents. I'm not going to just focus on arsenicals or Festins, but give you an idea of what types of chemical agents we've developed over the years and how they've been used. The first one is the most notorious, is the nerve agent. GA, GB, which is sarin. GA was the first ones developed, and VX. GA and GB were developed from organophosphates that were used for insecticides and pest control. However, they found that they could tweak them a little bit and make them extremely deadly for humans. VX was developed from something called VA, which was made by ICI Chemicals for pesticides, but it had a bad tendency to kill almost as many people or more people than it did anything else. The British, again, tweaked it and made it into VX, which is one of the deadliest compounds known to man, and it is a cholinesterase inhibitor. Vesicants, which you're most familiar with, there's several grades of mustard, distilled mustard, mustard that is not as pure, which was the first mustard they made, and then some tea variants, which were done to change the freezing point. These are all sulfur mustards because they're much more effective. There are nitrogen mustards used in chemotherapy and also favored in some respects by the German, but they're not nearly as effective as a chemical agent as mustard is. Lewisite, which I think most of you are familiar with, it's an arsenical, was never really used in war. It hydrolyzes and forms hydrochloric acid and chlorovinyl arsenic oxide. And it's not nearly as potent when it hydrolyzes as mustard was, or even lewisite if it doesn't. If you have an alkaline solution, you get trisodium arsenate. Lewisite's never been used in industry, and it was discovered in World War I at Spring Valley, but hasn't really been used in warfare because it so easily hydrolyzes in water. And if it's really humid, it also minimizes its potency. And it is an agent which can penetrate clothes and rubber, but because of its ability to so easily hydrolyze, it wasn't used specifically. Though we'll come back to it here in a minute. The Germans and the Japanese had some unique uses for it that the United States and Britain didn't. Going back to VX, like I said, it inhibits cholinesterase. It is a man-made chemical, and most of them have been made from or modified from the pesticides that we have. They're organophosphates, and they're obviously much more potent than those, but the treatments that you use on nerve agent are the same types of treatments that you would use on organophosphates. VX is typically colorless. It can be amber depending on any impurities or stabilizers added to it. Vapor pressure is pretty low. It's persistent. It doesn't really have, it was made to stick to leaves, to stick to buildings and so forth. And it is a consistency of motor oil. It's not really volatile. Its freezing point is pretty high. And again, it can last hours, days, it can last weeks. Its half-life is several weeks. So if it gets into the soil or cracks, crevices in the concrete or whatever, it will stay around for literally years. LCT 50 is very, very low, 10 milligrams per minute per cubic meter, and its skin LD 50 is 0.142 milligrams per kilogram. When I came into this business, they told me if you had a US penny and Lincoln were to have a tear, that tear would be enough VX to cause you significant issues. Hospital management of these types of nerve agents is you have to be very careful of victims who are contaminated with it or any chemical agent, because if they're not decontaminated properly, then you can get the people in the hospital and the emergency room can be impacted and contaminated by either direct contact or, in the case of sarin, by the off-gassing. And I mentioned earlier about, excuse me, the sarin in Tokyo, and it was a crude sarin, a not very pure sarin, but it did gas off, and they had it in a bag in some bottles, and that made the initial people sick who went to the hospital. But the majority of the people who got exposed were the people who cleaned it up, because it is both a liquid and a vapor because of the partial pressures of it. So, and both are highly toxic. And the people who cleaned it up became sicker, and many more of them actually died than some of the initial people who were exposed to the vapor of the GB. And even some of the taxi drivers and stuff that drove people to the hospital got contaminated because people had a liquid on them and they were gassing off. So the emergency responders, the cleaners, they were the ones that took the brunt of it, which is why decontamination of any of these types of toxic chemicals is extremely important. We are fortunate that for the nerve agents, they have developed medical countermeasures. Atropine and beryllium domoxin chloride, we call it 2-PAM because I'm getting tongue-tied. They are antidotes. When they destroy these agents in the chemical plants that they have built over across the United States and across the world, they usually carry 3 auto injectors with them holding atropine and 2-PAM chloride. And you usually need to admit it within 5 minutes to inject it. It was developed, this auto injector, by the military, and actually years later, after they developed for this program, it was given to industry to be used for EpiPens and such. So another thing that came out of this program that's actually been beneficial, for people. And then supportive measures are given in the hospital. Usually you give yourself 2 injections with the antidote, and then an EMT might give you a 3rd, and then under doctor's orders you might get a 4th. And then of course in the hospital, the doctors would give treatment as necessary to try to bring the symptoms under control. If you get to it within the first 5 minutes or so, usually is unless it's been an extreme exposure, it's usually pretty good for folks to survive it. Vesicants, on the other hand, are a little bit different. They're still toxic, but they have a different mechanism. You can see mustard, and it says toxic gas set M1. That is a vial that comes out of something called a chemical agent identification set. And those were used primarily in World War II so that the soldiers who were using them could understand what lewisite smelled like, so it smelled like germanium. So that, and then the mustard, how it would smell, and it would and phosgene smelled like freshly mowed grass, and so they typically had them in with simulants to give you that similar smell, with the exception of mustard. The original case sets had actual mustard in it. So if you wanted to know what mustard smelled like, you could open the bottle and smell it. And the chemical corps at that time actually took mustard from these vials and put a couple of drops on people so they could feel what it felt like to burn. And if you ever knew any folks from the Chemical Corps in the old days in the United States and also in some of the other countries, most of them will proudly show you those mustard scars that they got. But of course, now we know that mustard is also a potential carcinogen. So that practice was stopped in about the 1950s, early 60s. And as a side note, in World War II in Australia, they did a lot of testing with mustard where they actually put it on people who were volunteers, and they went through calisthenics training, simulated war drills to see what the impact would be and how long for various mustard exposures they could continue to fight. It's an interesting, there's a couple of books on it, and it's an interesting read if you ever have time. On the right is mentioned that so many were dumped at sea, 30,000 tons. That's ammunition recovered from the ocean from about after the World War II, from what we can tell. That one you couldn't tell is ammunition. That one is barnacle encrusted, but you'll see some of them that look as new as the day they were filled. And again, a vesicant produces vesicles or blisters. And the ones that we're typically familiar with are sulfur mustard, lewisite, and then of course, as you all mentioned, you're going to learn a little bit about phosgene oxime next time. It is considered a vesicant by the U.S. military, but just to know, it doesn't really give true blisters, but gives lesions that more resemble hives. So it's in the category, but it acts different than the mustard and the lewisite arsenical. Here you can see some of the properties and the colors. Mustard in its purest form is typically yellow, but most of the time, if you've seen mustard that's been drained out of any munitions or has been around for a while, it's pretty much a dark brown. It'll leach any ferric chloride out because it is very corrosive, and it typically changes color, and lewisite is also corrosive, so it also has a tendency to be a dark brown in color. And again, the odors, as we mentioned, I forgot about what mustard was, and it's garlic or mustard, and then of course lewisite, the familiar germanium. Strangely enough, if you look at the numbers, you'll see that mustard, distilled mustard, doesn't have a very high vapor pressure, but the partial pressure of it is such, we've actually had very, very good success in being able to detect the sulfur and be able to monitor for mustard. We can do pretty well with lewisite. It's very similar, but not quite as sensitive as it is for the distilled mustard. The volatility again is fairly low. The freezing point's the interesting thing. Mustard will freeze at 57 degrees Fahrenheit, 14C you see listed there. So when it goes into the ocean, for instance, when it was disposed of, they thought the salt water would corrode the munitions and the mustard would be hydrolyzed in the water. Well, that didn't happen because, for one thing, it was cold when they put them in the ocean. The other, because of the issues in the ocean, it actually preserved the munitions. It didn't allow them to really corrode at those cold temperatures, and the mustard was solid. So when they pull them up out of the ocean, we've had a lot of people exposed because the munition may have cracked, and then they get it up onto a boat or whatever, start looking at it or start handling it, and if it's a hot summer day, the mustard will start to thaw and actually leak out, and they'll become exposed. The other thing, mustard has a tendency to create a film on it, and so it will hide leaks. And then when it gets bumped or disturbed, all of a sudden that Band-Aid film that it has will disappear or shift, and it'll start leaking. Because of the freezing point, they originally weren't that disappointed if they had mustard that was impure, because it allowed the freezing point to be much higher. The biggest problem they ran into with some of the Levenstein type mustards they had that had a lot of impurities in it was those impurities had a tendency to be very corrosive, and it would eat out the storage containers, whether it was ton containers, drums, or whatever they had, and they were always having problems moving it around. And the Germans had the same issues. Later, the United States developed a distilled mustard method that was much purer, but it didn't solve the freezing point, so they would put chlorobenzene and other materials in. Germany and Japan took a slightly different approach that you'd be interested in. They used arsenical compounds to lower the freezing point or thickening agents. And then they could go from Finland to the Middle East in the case of Germany. Japan had, this is what they called it, the yellow bomb, and it was a 50-50 mixture of lewisite and mustard, and it was used to change the freezing point. And it was also used because, as I mentioned earlier, lewisite has almost immediate burning effect and mustard doesn't. And they wanted, when they used their blister agents, to not blister you immediately, and also to let you know that you had been exposed. And then the mustard, by taking longer, up to 12 to 48 hours longer to show symptoms, was just kind of the icing on the cake. So that was what they used. In Germany, they used something they called arsenal, which was a mixture of various arsenicals, but its primary ingredient was diphenylchloroarsine. And again, they used it, and the Germans were so sophisticated with theirs that they had different mixtures. As I mentioned, they had one that they could use in Norway for mustard. They had another one that they could use in the rest of the body of Europe. And then they had one which was fairly pure that they could use in the Middle East. So they had really developed it to a science, but fortunately for us, it was never used in World War II. Interestingly enough, on World War II, there was a lot of hesitation by both the Axis and the Allies on using chemical weapons. And the Pentagon originally approached President Roosevelt with the idea of attacking Japan using chemical weapons, primarily mustard. And because they had done tests on some islands on the mass that the Japanese used and the mass that the US used, using donkeys, and they found that the Japanese masks weren't very effective at all against our mustard and our chemical agents. And so they said that we could attack them and basically overcome them, because they would be impacted because it would penetrate their masks, but it wouldn't penetrate our soldiers' masks. And that would allow us to have victory over Japan. And Roosevelt was just horrified. He never wanted to use chemical weapons again. So they then went after the Manhattan Project. So rather interesting side note to history. Things could have been a lot different, but consider just the type of issues and concerns and just fear of chemical weapons we had even back then. Some of the clinical differences, as I said, mustard can take hours sometimes. The tissue damage is immediately, but the clinical effects, the blisters, and some of the intense pain happens up to 24 to 48 hours later. Both blisters look alike. Lewisite, like I said, was immediate, seconds to minutes, and looks very, very similar to mustard when lewisite is in its pure form. And then again, you can see some of the latency periods, the nausea, the vomiting, and the blistering. But one of the things about mustard is it's acute. And so after days after exposure, your eyesight starts to recover unless you've had a tremendous, exposure. And then even your respiratory problems will resolve, assuming you didn't have major damage. But if a typical attack or the use of the gas mask, it is considered acute. Nerve agents are also considered acute, but the nerve agent, there has been some association in Iraq with potential brain damage, though we don't really have a lot of data on that. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, with going back to mustard, it is a suspected carcinogen. We do have the ability to monitor. There are detection issues. It's not pure. Though most of what we destroy now is pure. We have had some Levenstein mustard that had a lot of impurities in it. There's a lot of issues with corrosion. It's been very difficult to handle. Monitoring is a little more suspect. We don't have a lot of data for lewisite. We've had some success in monitoring for it. The biggest problem we have is interference with mustard, because other types of sulfur compounds can go, and we do use a flame flame analyzer for it, and if it's sulfur will get into what we call the agent gate, or that area where we see the peaks on it. It also, especially lewisite, can be impacted by humidity. Temperature has to be pretty much at room temperature, and we have to be careful, because if we freeze it, we can't detect it. So we have to have it above 57, but if we get too hot, the detectors don't work correctly. So there are a lot of challenges, and what you see here with this is doing what they call quadrant monitoring on somebody. So they can check, they'll check one side on the leg and the other side on the leg, and then the upper chest area and the arms and the head, and they'll break it into 4 quadrants, and they'll monitor it during the cycle time of the near real-time units that we have, to see if the patient is contaminated. This is what we do in the destruction sites, to protect if we think somebody is exposed, and then before we treat them, we will try to decontaminate and make sure they're clean. If they're in distress, though, we go immediately to whatever is required for the patient. Occupational limits, we don't have a lot for lewisite. Mustard we do, and as you can see, the GPL at the very bottom is the general population limit, and it's 2 × 10⁻⁵, I believe, milligrams per cubic meter. So it's pretty low. The worker population limit is 4 × 10⁻⁴, which is a little bit higher, and then another 3 × 10⁻³ for the 15-minute exposure limit, and the IDLH is 0.7. It is also the same for lewisite right now, because we don't have any numbers for lewisite, so we strictly use the mustard. NOSH is working on some numbers, but we haven't gotten anything new yet. As I said, most of these are liquids. We talk about mustard gas. That's a misnomer. They would fire the weapons and then hopefully disperse them as part of the explosion, and that's how they got exposed to the mustard. Is not really a gas. In fact, if we're not careful, it's a solid at temperatures like we've been having this week, it'd be a solid. And then as we mentioned about sarin, both vapor and liquid hazard can occur, and then the G agents, sarin and so forth, are more volatile than VX. Over the years, they mentioned detection. They originally detected what they call M8 paper. That's what they call it now, and it's sort of like pH paper, and it will change color, obviously. But these are fairly high limits. You saw the lower limits on blister for agent, and this is higher than the IDLH to detect these. So they have to be in proper PPE just to see if they've got it. And once they start decontaminating it, the paper isn't very effective. It's really a gross detection. They have an Eyecam, which is a chemical agent monitor to improved chemical agent monitor, as they call it. It does allow for detection, but some of the lower limits that we have on these that still have health effects, because of the background, having it outside, you just can't get that low with these. But it is a good device for handheld. And then a newer version of that is the Saber Unit, which is one of the newer ones that some of the emergency responders use. It does go to lower limits, but then depending on what you have in your matrix around wherever you are, other types of interferences, especially from sulfur, will make it difficult to detect the mustard. Chemical incidents, I'm sure most of you really know this, but it's always worth reviewing. As we've mentioned, a lot of the people, both cleaning, and then we got the cabs, and some other people got impacted by the sarin release in Tokyo, and 85% of the victims or the people exposed in any kind of chemical incident that we've reviewed over the years tend to leave the scene before the emergency responders are able to even get there. If the emergency responders can start giving treatment, we have medical countermeasures, or if you have the blisters, they can start treating that than being treated at the hospital's low mortality rate. If you remember the incident in Salisbury, the two people that were exposed in the house, the Soviet dissident and his daughter, both survived, but the lady who had the perfume bottle, who they delayed calling the emergency responders all on, didn't make it. So we lost 1 out of 3, and had they been able to get to her sooner, she would have had a much better chance of survival. And so anybody, if you can get them to the hospital and respond quickly, time is of the essence, especially with chemical agents. And then sometimes, as in the case of the incident in Italy and Bari, you might have a combined injury. They have a chemical exposure of mustard, but they had burns from the oil fires. Or you might have a chemical fire or a fire explosion, be burned from that, and then also be exposed to the chemical agents. So, and then in large scale events like we've seen with COVID, there's always an issue in dealing with chronically ill patients and other type of patients as hospitals start getting overwhelmed in these. Somebody has asked me, why destroy the weapons? What's the storage risk? And as these, these weapons were used, developed and filled in the Cold War back in the 50s. So these have been in storage for over 60 years. And as I mentioned, especially with mustard, it breaks down in HCl. And so they corrode and they begin to leak. So there's a fairly high storage risk here. And then you can see as we go out and we start destroying the weapons, the risk eventually drops until it's 0 for that community. We've had 9 communities that weapons were stored in, including Anniston, Alabama, which is not far from UAB. And that facility was shut down, was finished its work in 2011. We have 2 facilities out of 9 left. And they're scheduled to finish in 2024. And we've had all the agents that we've been talking about here, as well as delivery systems from spray tanks down to mines. So it's been very, very difficult. If you look at that probability, continued storage is somewhere just north of an airline crash in terms of probability. But when you go to destruction, it goes down in 4 times 10 to the minus 8, several magnitudes of risk lower, and it's probably even lower than that. During the destruction, it's lower than that. After the destruction, it goes to 0. So you can kind of get some idea of the risk involved with storage, even versus trying to move it around and destroy it. Incineration, I'll quickly go through this. This was an original preferred method, and we would move whatever was in from a weapon to a ton container. We'd separate the munitions. We would take rockets and other explosives and put them into a furnace. We had pollution abatement system. The liquid agent went into a liquid incinerator. We also had a pollution abatement system. And then any medical components like bullets, projectiles, or whatever, ton containers, they were thermally cleaned in what we call a metal parts furnace. And then also any of that gas went to a pollution abatement system. Now, we had a lot of people who were very much against incineration. Incineration was not, in some countries don't even allow incineration, but we found we monitored the stack gases for agent with these extremely sensitive instruments we had. We could control the matrix and keep it fairly clean, and we found them to be extremely efficient. But most people were very concerned that there would be toxic agents spewing out of the stacks, and it would kill them. Anniston, Alabama was one where they were very, very concerned about that. The biggest risk to the public, and the reason we got involved, is, as I mentioned, mustard forms a crust over it, and in some of these chemicals, when they break down, they become very corrosive, and so you would have leaks as you moved them from where they were stored to be destroyed. Over time, as we found more and more leaking, they came up with devices to put them in. They call them enhanced on-site containers. They were not to contain any explosion. They were contain vapors to make it safe to go from the storage area to the destruction site. And then they were taken out of those after they were monitored to make sure, again, they would be protected. In the incineration plant, they had cascading ventilation with a lower pressure being where the agent would be, and then the highest pressure, which would go and feed in through the cascading system, would be the outside air. So everything would go out through the stack and be treated before it went out through HEPA filters, carbon filters, and so on. So the other thing we developed, one of the reasons I got involved, was chemical agent neutralization. We mentioned that lewisite will hydrolyze fairly easily. And then, so what we've done is develop methods. They use primarily water and sodium hydroxide. It will neutralize all of them, but it has to be at it has to be extremely well mixed and at fairly high temperatures, 300 degrees or so. And then the biggest problem with it over incineration is it was effective in destroying the agent, but it created a lot of liquid waste, which has to be dealt with at an offsite facility. And then we still had the problem with anything metal, whether it was a ton container or a munition or even a rocket, had to be thermally treated. So we still couldn't get away from thermal treatment. So, but it's been pretty effective. The most difficult of all the agents we had to destroy, and the agents I might mention here, when they were made to be used, not destroyed. So they were never really thought how they would get rid of them. There was no magic button to get rid of them. And one of the most difficult, even though when you say, well, it can hydrolyze easily, was lewisite, because when it broke down, it formed acetylene and some other things that were pretty nasty to deal with. So when they tried to develop a neutralization process, it tended to be, I'll just say, an explosive approach. We actually reviewed it. It was one of the processes that we found was not able to meet the safety requirements we had for the public, and they came up with another method. Because of the arsenicals and some of the other things, incineration had never really been considered, but I handed to the Army and their contractors. They developed some processes, and we were able to successfully incinerate it in Tooele and have destroyed all the lewisite that was left in the stockpile. But that was, it took us 20 or 30 years to figure out exactly how to do that. And so ironically, it ended up being our most difficult to figure out a technology to develop. We do assessments. There's a Stokes munition. I mentioned a chemical identification set, and these bottles would be in these tubes. And then these have been buried in 40 of the 50 United states in the United States and all across the world. Real quickly, Spring Valley. In World War I, well, they found material that was left over from the development in World War I in the South Korean ambassador's backyard. This is in DC. That's a 75 millimeter, though it looks to me like something a dog left in the backyard of this. And this is one of the original experimental stations of American University, where they did work on mustard and primarily lewisite. And these chemical agents are buried all over the place. And what we found was that the ground was just absolutely contaminated with arsenic at an average of 57 parts per million and as high as 500 parts per million. So arsenic was literally everywhere around, and found it even in the residents of the valley and so forth. We found arsenic trichloride under the steps, and almost all of it actually came from this. It was a fairly sprawling site. A lot of work was done in World War I, and it was literally all over this, what was now, it was turned into a subdivision. I mentioned recovery from the ocean. This ESS Pursuit, they pulled up a munition, and it leaked on them, and 2 people went to the hospital and were treated for mustard. And of course, we had to activate a response and so forth. And we had never responded to anything like this. And this was outside of Massachusetts. So it was a pretty significant event, and it really got us to rethink about how we deal with this. But this was not a mortar or a projectile. It was what they termed as a canister, and it was dated 1918. So we the Army traced back its records and found that this was the exact location where they had dumped material after World War I. And some of it came from Spring Valley and Edgewood, Maryland, where they were doing a lot of the tests beginning and through World War I. So we do know that even though lewisite wasn't used, we still have a lot of munitions that had lewisite in them. And some of the materials were dumped. So there's some in the ocean, and there's quite a bit that's buried around the United States. As I mentioned, there's a barnacle encrusted one, but then on the right, those look almost brand new, and they came out of the ocean not too far away from each other. Just real quickly, we do look at the engineering, the technology they use, as I mentioned about the lewisite technology. We also look at medical readiness, because in dealing with these weapons and the potential leaks, we want to make sure that everybody is safe, including the community. We have been on the pioneering edge of the chemical monitoring technology and working with the Army, working with NIOSH to develop that. And then we partner with our public health professionals to really work and make sure that this destruction, and it's been done successfully, 90+% of the weapons have been destroyed with no real issues. So that's from Matt. I know I was a tiny bit long, but any questions, feel free.
Not at all, Terry. This was such an amazing chronicle of this important history in our community. I wanted to ask a couple of questions that are coming through here to the chat. One of them is related to the current state. Where are we in the U.S.? Are we 100% done, or are we still active in destruction?
When we finish in the United States in 2024, that will be everything that we declared in our stockpile. So we will be done with that. As I mentioned, we've had over 400, I didn't mention the number, but there have been over 400 recovered weapons from the ocean and across the United States that we still deal with. And for people who've been to Europe, you may have seen some of the telephone poles in Belgium and some of the other areas that will look like holes in them with little, if you will, like a little pad. Those are actually when the farmer finds ammunition left over from World War II or World War I. They put them in there, and they call the military, and they come and pick them up and dispose of them.
Dr. Patrick Murray, who's one of our colleagues up north, he's a toxicologist as well. He was asking what is allowed in terms of emissions. What type of chemicals are allowed to be emitted in the incineration process or the hydrolysis? Any input?
It has to be below the general population limit. So it would have to be for mustard. It's 3 times 10 to the minus 5, and I think for VX it's 2 times, I believe, 10 to the minus 6 or minus 8. I can't remember the number off the top of my head. But to be honest, if we get any type of detection on our instruments, we stop processing and try to figure out what's going on, because nothing should be breaking through. So if there's a detection, we usually stop and try to ensure that nothing is getting through at all. What went wrong in the process.
Mr. Vitash is asking, are there any sites in the U.S. that are still working on sulfur mustard destruction, or are they all done?
Oh, absolutely. There's a site in Pueblo, Colorado, that is all sulfur mustard. They've destroyed half of their stockpile. I believe that their number was, we had 2,700 tons left. We had 30,000 tons in our stockpile, about what we dumped in the ocean when we started. And we've got about a little less than that, a little less than 3,000 now done. So they had about 2,000 tons out there in various munitions, primarily 155 projectiles, 105 projectiles, and 4.2-inch mortars. And that's what they have had in theirs.
Can you comment on the public health communication strategies when you are, doing something in a town like Anniston or?
Well, Anniston was a unique one.
And it doesn't have to be Anniston.
I know, but it was actually unique because the FEMA and the Army have a program called CSEP, the Chemical Emergency Stockpile Preparedness Plan. And at the Anniston facility, there was a lot of concern about toxic materials and such. And they actually gave people PAPRs, which are
Air purifying respirators.
yes, yeah, they're powered air purifying respirators. They can put them on and they're good for 2 hours. So we didn't do that at any of the other sites, but Anniston, we did supply those for them. But each site has what we call CSEP, and they regularly, twice a year, go through drills. And a lot of what they developed, they fed into their normal emergency response and ERTs as well. So it's been a pretty good program that we've used over the years. And then we get involved with the public health department on the destruction and the safety as well.
And then are there any, I mean, I personally am aware of hazards in the incineration process. I know with two German workers exposed to mustard most recently after, destroying chemicals brought back from Syria. Mm-hmm. Have you all had to deal with that as well? Have we had workers in the destruction process exposed?
We have, and typically what's happened is we have the Army in the United States develop very, very specific protocols, and we have worked with them on those protocols along with their contractors. And we've had a handful of exposures, I think 2 GB and 1 mustard maybe over the 35 years we've been involved in it. And every single one of those is because they didn't follow the protocols. They either failed to communicate or thought that, in the case of mustard, they thought it was oil. And so they got exposed. None of the exposures were life-threatening. They did see symptoms, the meiosis and nerve agent, minor redness, not even blistering in the mustard, but we still consider them exposures.
Incredible work, Terry, and thank you again for your dedication, for your career. I hope you consider one day writing this into an autobiography, a novel, because I think it's really fascinating. And this is the type of information that I personally am going to tell my colleagues about, to go, and if they could not catch the live webinar today, catch the recording. Remember to do that as well with your colleagues in your circles of professionals.
I appreciate it. I hope that you all found it interesting, and as you're working on the weapons and so forth for this, at least now you have some idea of why they came to be, and then hopefully never will be again. Thank you.
I hope so as well. Back at you, Amina. Thank you.
Thank you all for attending. This webinar will be available on our website, and we look forward to seeing you at another Grand Rounds presentation.